Andy suggested that I talk about Ukraine's relationship over the past year with Russia and with Europe. So let me break my talk into four pieces. First, what's going on with Russia? What's going on with Europe? Third, the balance between those two vectors. And then fourth, the impact of the democratic backsliding that we've seen over the past year. But my starting point is going to be back at the end of March of last year when Strobe Talbot, the head of Brookings, Javier Solana, the former foreign policy chief of the European Union, were in Kyiv, and I was with them. And then we had the chance to meet with President Yanukovych and Foreign Minister Hryshchenko and a number of other senior Ukrainian officials. And what we heard very clearly, this was about a month after the president had taken office, was in foreign policy terms, they believed that the relationship with Russia had deteriorated to the point where it was negative for Ukraine's interests. And they were very clear that their first foreign policy priority would be to restore a better relationship with Russia. Now, they also made clear that they said that we would see over time that effort to rebuild a relationship with Russia would be in the context of a broader policy to maintain balance between relations with Russia on the one hand and relations with Europe on the other hand. Now, this might not be the vision that a lot of people in this room share, but I think it's fair to say that when President Yanukovych campaigned for the presidency, he was very clear on foreign policy terms about his desire to change the relationship with Russia. And certainly, if you look at the polling over the last year, that course has been endorsed by a majority of Ukrainians. Now, I don't think a lot of Ukrainians want to rejoin Russia, but I think the polling does show that most Ukrainians don't want to have a difficult relationship with Russia. And I suspect a lot of the opposition, when polls typically show 60-65% of Ukrainians don't want to join NATO, I don't read that as anti-NATO. I read that as that's a complication in terms of the relationship with Moscow. But let me talk a bit about the Russian vector. And I think as Yanukovych and officials told us when we were there at the end of March, they moved very quickly in a very focused way to try to reestablish relations with Russia. And the biggest event that we saw was, of course, the meeting in Kharkiv, where Ukraine agreed to extend the lease for the Black Sea Fleet use of facilities in Sevastopol and Crimea from 2017 out until 2042 in return for a different deal in terms of gas purchases. Now, what the Ukrainian government said was they got basically an agreement with Russia to reduce the gas price for Ukraine's purchases by about $1 billion per year, which if that's applied to the lease, that's actually about 10 times the amount that Ukraine was receiving for the lease for the facilities in Sevastopol and Crimea. Now, I think from the point of view of President Yanukovych and Prime Minister Zaev, that seemed like a good deal for a government that was facing a very difficult economic picture. People smarter than me about energy prices say, well, maybe not. I mean, if you look at other countries in Western and Central Europe, in fact, they were able to renegotiate long-term gas contracts with Russia without having to make these kinds of political concessions. But that's probably another debate. But you've seen this kind of movement. You've seen reestablishments of link between the aerospace industries, the nuclear industries. That shows that, in fact, as President Yanukovych said he was going to do during the campaign, he's tried to change the relationship with Russia and build it in a more positive direction. Now let's talk for a moment about the European vector. I think it was also very clear that when President Yanukovych took office, one, he did not want to see Ukraine in NATO. He had no interest in a membership action plan. But what we have seen over the course of the past year is a lot of practical cooperation between NATO and Ukraine. And I'm sure that Jim will talk about that in a moment in more detail. I just make one observation, is that when you look at the Ukrainian military today, the Minister of Defense is headed by Minister Yezhel, who was the head of the Ukrainian Navy when I was there, and somebody who was hugely interested in NATO cooperation, and then saw that cooperation as being very important to his effort to modernize the Ukrainian Navy. And the other point I would make is that if you look at the cadre of Ukrainian military officers, captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, for the last 15 years, when they've talked about military-to-military cooperation, it's been primarily with the United States and NATO. There's a lot of group there that has a very good understanding of NATO and sees that relationship as important to their ability to modernize the military. So I think, regardless of where the Ukrainian government wants to go in the long term with NATO, practical cooperation is likely to continue. But from the perspective of President Yanukovych and what he said, the focus of the European vector now is the European Union. And this boils down really at the moment to a negotiation of an association agreement, a big piece of that being a free trade arrangement, and then associated with that would be a visa liberalization agreement. This is a potentially big deal, but it's also a very difficult negotiation, in part because the European Union does not offer a lot of flexibility. They have a set of trade regime terms, and they basically offer Ukraine to sign up to those terms. And it's going to require that the government in Kyiv make some very difficult and perhaps painful decisions. We heard from a number of people from the Ukrainian side this last week that they're very concerned about the sort of concessions they would have to make in the agricultural sector in order to conclude a free trade arrangement. And the European Union, I mean, we've known this for years, is protective of established agricultural sectors in France and elsewhere. And that's going to require some difficult decisions that will affect people who are perhaps close to the presidential administration and their direct agricultural interests. So we'll see how that plays out. There's talk that they might try to conclude that arrangement over the course of the year. I hope they do so, because to my mind, that's key to balance. Now, in terms of the balance between East and West, I think we have seen some signs. Russia has pushed several times for Ukraine to join the customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And every time that's come up, the president and his government have made clear that no, they prefer the free trade arrangement with Europe and the European Union. And that's logical. I mean, on one hand, you have a case of joining a customs union with three post-Soviet states. The alternative is joining the largest and richest common market in the world. And so I think that's an indication that there's an economic calculation here as to what is in Ukraine's best interest. If Ukraine can get the association agreement, the free trade arrangement with the European Union, I'm actually quite comfortable that they will establish balance. That will be a huge anchor in terms of anchoring Ukraine to the West. If they fail to get that, I would worry. And my worry would be that Ukraine would become unbalanced in its relationships. It would not have the balance that was described to us a year ago as being a long-term goal of Ukrainian policy, and that might have the impact of limiting Ukraine's freedom of maneuver vis-a-vis Moscow. And that should be of concern to President Yanukovych and his government, because Russian and Ukrainian interests are not on every issue aligned. And I'll give three examples. Energy prices, the prices that Ukraine pays to buy gas and oil from Russia, that's a straightforward zero-sum game. If Ukraine lowers the prices and wins, Russia loses. Second, the transit prices that Russia pays to move gas and oil through Ukraine to Europe. Again, the higher the price that Ukraine can command for the transit of energy, the more that Russia has to pay. It's a zero-sum game. And I think perhaps the most blatant example we've seen over the last year is the South Stream pipeline that Russia wants to build through the Black Sea around Ukraine to move gas from Russia under the Black Sea to Romania or Bulgaria. There are no new gas deposits identified for that pipeline. And if that pipeline is built, I'm not sure it will be, but if it is built and gas goes through the pipeline, it's only going to be gas that comes out of pipelines that now move across Ukraine. So there are differences in the issues. And I think actually the Yanukovych government understands this. When I was in Kyiv back in June, already you begin to hear some irritation coming from people connected with the presidential administration that Ukraine had moved to change the relationship with Russia, but Russia was still pursuing projects such as South Stream, which were directly detrimental to Ukrainian interests. Now, I think they understand this. The question is, will they act and again make some difficult decisions with regards to relations with the European Union that will give them some balance and more freedom of maneuver between the West and Moscow. For my last point, let me address just briefly the question of democratic backsliding, which I worry about that both for what it means internally for Ukrainians, but I also worry about it in terms of what it means for Ukrainian foreign policy. Now, for those of you who were at Carnegie last Monday, Foreign Minister Yushchenko was there, and he gave a very eloquent and strong defense of democratic practices in Ukraine. And I think some of the points he made had some validity, but I still think if you look at the picture of what's happened in Ukraine domestically over the past year, by almost any measure, it's been moving in the wrong direction. And that the perception that's created in the West has consequences. And it has, I think, negative consequences for Ukrainian foreign policy. And specifically, it's going to make it more difficult for Ukraine to move closer to the European Union. Unfortunately for Ukraine, in the European Union today, as it seems all too often, the European Union is looking inward. It's dealing with the Eurozone crisis. It's dealing with how to implement the Lisbon Treaty. It's not devoting a lot of time, energy, and creativity to thinking about how it engages with its largest Eastern partner. And for those who want to push the European Union to take a more proactive stance towards Ukraine, the fact that you have this image and this perception, and I think in some cases, unfortunately, the reality of democratic backsliding is going to make it that much harder for those Europeans who want to work with Ukraine to move the European Union to engage Ukraine in a more proactive way. So it's going to make it more difficult for President Yanukovych to achieve what he's articulated as an important goal, which is integrating Ukraine into Europe and drawing closer to the European Union. I'll stray just briefly, just a comment on American policy. I think it also makes it more difficult for President Yanukovych to engage the United States. And I've heard before that one of the things that the Ukrainian government would like to achieve is they see value to high-level meetings. They would like to have an early meeting between President Obama and President Yanukovych, and I can understand that. But I think this perception that Ukraine is moving in the wrong direction on democracy is going to make Larry's job of trying to set up that meeting more difficult. I'm not sure it's, particularly also even more so in the aftermath of what's gone on in Egypt and Tunisia. The perception that Ukraine is moving more towards a Belarusian direction than a Polish direction is not going to make it easy to persuade the president, that this is something that ought to be high on his list of priorities. So I think actually President Yanukovych may understand this. It was interesting when he went to Davos in January, the reporting was he had a fairly thin schedule of meetings. I also saw reports saying that he blamed his foreign ministry for this. I think that blame was misplaced, but I think that shows one of the consequences of this democratic backsliding. And hopefully, as the president understands it, these are consequences which undermine his foreign policy. That actually may be a reason that he will look at rethinking some of the domestic policies that we've been seeing and putting in place over the past year. Thank you.